I'm Karen Elliott. Welcome to the District of Squamish's very first podcast, District B-Sides, where you'll hear in-depth conversations with council, staff, and community members to take you behind the decisions that are being made on topics that matter to Squamish. District B-Sides will be led by hosts Natasha Golbeck, Tori Hansen, and Matt Gunn. Let's tune in and join their conversation.
Hello, I'm Matt Gunn, and I'm pleased to host the very first Squamish B-Sides. We're excited to bring this podcast to the community and hope it'll be an opportunity to dive deeper on topics that are of interest to you. Remember, this is our first episode, so if there's things that we can do to make it better, please reach out and let us know. Housing affordability is a multifaceted, complex issue that we as a district have been working hard to tackle in recent years. What is our role? How can we balance community growth and pressure from the Lower Mainland with affordability challenges for longtime residents and frontline service staff? These are tough questions about a topic that our council takes very seriously, and we're going to talk about some of those tough questions today. First, we're going to hear from a leader in community social housing, Maureen Mchale of Helping Hands. We'll also hear from two district councillors, Armand Hurford and Jenna, as well as what will become a regular podcast feature, our Heritage Moment. Let's get to the conversation. Our first guest here to talk about affordable housing at Squamish is Maureen Mchale, the Executive Director of Squamish Helping Hands. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Tell me a bit about your role with Helping Hands as it relates to affordable housing here in town.
So as you said, I am the Executive Director for Squamish Helping Hands. And basically, our main tenet or our main mission is to provide housing for our most vulnerable folks in town. I have to make sure and keep my eye on the ball, making sure that people are housed and that housing is a human right, and we see it that way.
It's a big role.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
At a high level, what is the story of affordable housing in Squamish? What do you see having happened over the last decade or so?
Hindsight is 20/20, right? When you look back, there's a lot of things that we might have been able to see, but it is about being able to predict the future a little bit. And so we maybe didn't do that well enough. I think the 2010 Olympic Games was a real change for us, more people, more eyes on our town. And then, of course, when the gondola came in, it just went so quickly. We weren't ahead of that game to realize we're going to be in trouble with housing. And so it hit us.
Who do you think has been most impacted by some of the changes?
I always say that it impacts everybody. Of course, our most vulnerable folks, it has impacted in massive ways. There is no housing for our folks. So I run a shelter, and with that shelter, generally those are supposed to be 30-day stays. That's an emergency response to someone not having housing. Whereas in our community, lots of our folks live there 365 days a year, and that's mats on the ground in a very small space, the old fire hall on 3rd Avenue.
Beyond the shelter, do you have a sense of other situations that people are kind of creating to deal with the affordable housing challenges?
Absolutely. I think people, there's so many different aspects. People on one end are providing, doing the whole secondary suites. That became a big thing. And then Airbnb sort of slammed that a bit. But there are folks who are living in cars, on boats, that in vans, and that issue has come up. And most recently, there are a lot of people in Squamish living in vans, even some that stay most of the year. So I think people are responding as best they can. Lots of roommate situations, but it's very precarious, I would say. I also think our kids, so I'm 60. Our kids are, young adults. A lot of them are feeling they have to leave town in order to afford housing because it's so far from their reach.
Today we've got really high prices. I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast will be familiar with the high housing costs that they're facing and maybe the high rental rates that they're facing, or the difficulty of finding places to rent. How does that relate to other people in the housing spectrum?
Yeah, I think what you might be getting at is that upper echelon, we keep adding to that upper echelon of housing, it seems to me. If we keep adding to that and it's not affordable, then only people who can afford it and the higher echelon of the continuum will be taking those on. And then that pushes that next group down. So let's say the professionals in our community, nurses, social workers, who used to be able to afford, our top house are now in that next level down of housing. Well, that next level down of housing was once occupied by our workforce, the people who work at Starbucks and the grocery store and that sort. So now they're taking the next level down, say the lowest on the spectrum, and that leaves people who used to occupy that low end of the spectrum into emergency, no housing, living in vans and cars. And do you see what I mean? So each group and where they're coming from, I think the problem with Squamish is that we've had many people influx into our community because it is so beautiful and it's, been highlighted in the world now. So now we have this huge upper level because it's less expensive than North Van and less expensive, say, than Vancouver and parts of Vancouver. So now that is happening. Every part on that spectrum are being pushed down to another form of housing.
Let's look into the future and imagine that our community doesn't take a lot of action to address these challenges. Where could you see Squamish winding up in, say, a decade?
I think we're going to be in big trouble. I think everybody has to remember that it works for everybody to take care of our most vulnerable. It is actually a really good plan for people who want to live in a community where they feel safe, but not only safe, where there aren't people in the streets, where there is a sense of neighbor and community. If we do not take care of our most vulnerable and the lowest end of the continuum, we just create problems for ourselves.
Yeah, it sounds like there's kind of two pieces here. There's the need to take care of the entire spectrum from a standpoint of creating the community that we want to have, but there must also be an equity piece to that need to take care of everyone in the spectrum. And I'm sure you must see the lack of equity that occurs in certain situations.
Well, when you say that lack of equity, I right away go to it costs us more to not deal with this issue. It costs community much more in housing, emergency services, RCMP, all of that starts to cost more. And also it costs more to house people in an emergency situation. So we're building a building to provide housing. I've basically gone to BC Housing and said, with the same amount of money that you give us, instead of housing 15 people per night, we can house up to 60 people. So, right away, you can see there that cost, when we house people, costs go down. Cost per person goes down. And when we house people, we are less likely to have, a huge impact on the emergency response system, on the emergency at the hospital. All those things are expensive, really expensive. And when people are housed, they don't need those services quite so much. So I'm not sure if that was the question you were asking, but that's what comes to mind when I talk about equity and, on the financial end of things.
Tell me a bit about the Housing First approach.
Housing First is very simple. It certainly speaks to the National Housing Strategy where, Trudeau talked about housing being a human right. So the Housing First, that's a perfect marriage right there. Housing being a human right, and the Housing First model is we don't care where you are on your health and well-being. We don't care if you have addictions. We don't care if you have a mental illness or a physical illness that hasn't been dealt with. Housing comes first because you cannot deal with mental, physical, addiction, any of those issues until you're housed. If you expect people to deal with their addictions, let's say, or a mental illness while they're sleeping on the floor in a old firehouse 365 days a year, it's not going to happen. When they're living like that, they're living in a survival mode. So if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, bottom line is those basic needs. That's where they are. They're just getting fed. They're just making sure they have somewhere to stay out of the cold. When you put people in housing, when people are housed or you give them a home, I prefer to say, then they can go out of panic mode, out of survival mode, and start to then sort of go, okay, what steps can I take? And then with Housing First, it absolutely has to come with supports. So there's many levels of support. So we were talking about supportive housing, what we'll be doing it under one roof. That's full support. And we'll have different levels of support even within that building. When you have housing that's tenancy and in community, you still need, that can still be housing first. It still needs supports, outreach workers, connection to doctors, all of that, so that they don't fall off the edge, they don't fall off our radar.
The work that you're engaged in, providing supportive housing for people, critical for sure. Do you see examples where it creates a big difference in people's lives?
1,000%. It is so remarkable what happens when you house a person. It is beyond what I even imagined. So when you house someone, within weeks, you'll see a difference in that person. You'll see them come to life again. You'll see somebody who had sores all over their face start to heal. It's so remarkable that it's inspiring, and I have to say I really love seeing it. Sometimes people aren't ready, but in general, if you've put everything together and you've got a good case plan and you put somebody in housing using the housing first approach, they just blossom. And I see it every day. I actually work out of our transition house. One of our very first, so when we got that transition house, we had a young man join us, a local young man who's actually gone on record to talk about this with the chief. His name is Dan, and he started out, really struggling with addictions, struggling with a number of things, and finally, was ready enough to come into the housing, that the little of housing that we had came in, and he is now. We got him a job we work with Target Homes, doing low barrier workforce jobs, and so they were like, yeah, let's do this, and he started working with them, and then he, when we talked about it, and Dave Rancier got back to me, and he's like, the framers are hiring him. He's not even going to work for us anymore. The next thing it's just getting better and better, and he talked to me recently. He's working for the tugboats, and his life is on track. And I don't mean that in the sense of, what we think is on track. His life is on track for him. And he is such an incredible human being, always has been, but now he gets to show it. And it kind of brings up another point, and if I may, that if we just try to give people homes and, support them with food and community without also pushing, moving the dial on a sense of purpose, we're missing the mark. We have to do that while also helping to provide a sense of purpose. Once those four things, housing, food, community, and purpose, are in place, people's lives are changed forever.
That's really fantastic. Are there any common myths or perceptions about affordable housing that you think would be worth talking about and trying to dispel?
I'd like to answer that by saying us and them. That's a big myth or reality we keep perpetuating that should not exist. There is no us and them. So just because you can afford, or someone can afford, a house in Crumpet Woods or wherever is desirable in Squamish, you are no different than that person who can't afford anything, who's living in their boat or who's living in emergency shelter. And as a community, we are as strong as our weakest link, or we are as strong as the community we have built. And so my job over the years has always been to keep saying the same thing. What kind of community do we want to be? And my answer to that is, we want to be a community where everybody matters and everybody counts. So, it's back to, a difference in economic status is starting to define and put pressure on that us and them myth. They're really in a happy, well designed community, there can't be an us and them. And what's remarkable, which goes back to your other question around what's happened to people when they're housed, is that's the thing. We keep that us and them divide or barrier happening the more we do not care for the ones at the bottom and do not provide housing, because they can't show their best selves from a place of zero housing. The other myth I think that we should address or look at is the myth that it'll all take care of itself. Right? Everybody thinks, well, it'll all work out. Everything will, there'll be a nice big shuffle and it'll all be okay. I think we're seeing very specifically here in Squamish that is not the case.
Invisible hand?
You would think, right? The more that comes online, the more affordable it would be. It does not seem to be happening. And is that because so many are just coming to fill those units from elsewhere? Maybe. I've lived other places where that is the case, where, you add units and everything settles down. There's, sure, things increase, but not to the degree that we're seeing here in Squamish.
What's underway right now in Squamish?
So right off the bat, I've referenced this already. Under One Roof is a new project that's coming, will be available or opening in September 2020. And that is a purely supportive housing project for now. We may have to adapt if that doesn't work. If we need other housing, for instance, we have like 3 floors of housing, so maybe the top floor will have to change to something else. So that's one project that's coming online that's well underway. BC Housing has funded. The other projects that are underway are the seniors project, which is going to bring, I think, about 240 units online. I don't know the exact numbers around that one, whether that's 240 extra or 240 in total. I think that's the in total. And that's coming, and I'm not sure of their date. The other project that's in the works is the one they're calling the Buckley Project, which is a project between BC Housing and the district. Most people are looking at that project, or many people are looking at that project, and are not seeing that it's affordable. So the answer to that, or some people's answer to that, would be, well, you can get subsidies to make it affordable. However, when I'm talking to single parents of 2 and 3 children who are, making in the $50,000 range, they're saying we're getting caught in the middle there because we can't afford it. It doesn't seem affordable, and yet we're likely not going to be eligible for subsidies to go with that. So those are the 3 projects that I see coming online that are going to help, but they nowhere near address the problem now and the upcoming problem.
How do you define affordable housing?
Well, one classic definition of affordable housing would be that it costs 30% of your income. So that's been a long-standing definition, and I quite agree that works for everybody to look at.
Right, I guess that leaves money for the other necessities of life and some extra at the end of the day, so that you can live a normal life and be housed.
Absolutely, and be able to buy your kids the clothes they need, put food, healthy, nutritious food on the table, be able to go to a movie once in a while. A simple life, not an extravagant life. Just a simple life.
Are there actions that you feel like we really need to be taking but aren't, or that we need to identify now and start moving on?
Yeah, I really do think a big one for me in our sector is having a housing authority of sorts. And I don't want to use the word authority to match what Whistler has, but just an authority or an agency that is made up, that is the district coming together with the nonprofit sector or the housing sector, as well as developers and nonprofit leaders, as many people at that table, where we are really looking at it strategically together. I think that's a really important phase, and I think we have to be communicating better from council and the municipality to the nonprofit housing sector to make sure that we're getting the best body there. The other thing people need to know, that there is a real tension between municipalities and the province, because housing falls within the provincial stream. And, when I've had arguments with previous mayors, I say, I agree, housing is within the provincial mandate and everything, but the province is bringing it. So, for instance, through BC Housing, the province is bringing quite a bit of money to this Under One Roof project, also bringing money to the seniors project, also bringing money to the district, the Buckley Project. So, yes, but we can't get away from it also being a municipal responsibility and issue. And I think maybe from a municipal side, it's about being strategic. And so then being able to harness monies that are coming down the pike and that kind of thing by being strategic and knowing what we need and acting on it.
Maureen, thanks a ton for sitting down with us. I really appreciate having the chance to hear your perspective, but also community really owes a debt to you for the work that you do. And thank you very much for your continued work in Squamish.
Thank you so much for having me. It is really a privilege to do work in this town.
And now it's time for our Heritage Moment, during which you can expect to hear lesser-known facts and stories from community members that have formed part of Squamish's history. In this episode, we're joined by District Councillor Eric Anderson, who will give us a brief history of affordable and purpose-built housing in our community.
Hello, I'm Eric Anderson, a District of Squamish councillor, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about Squamish affordable housing, a bit of a historical perspective. Today, Squamish is in a period of stress relating to lack of affordable housing. The town has experienced this before. This time, the housing affordability problem is mostly resulting from our being more closely tied to the Lower Mainland and its issues. We also have expanding tourism and related service businesses. In past periods, our housing supply just wasn't keeping up with an expanded local economy, a Squamish jobs boom. Today and in the past, employers have been affected and have needed to respond. Some examples from the past are interesting, of employers and the community working together. They have helped build and shape our neighborhoods. Numerous employers have been directly involved in providing housing for employees and their families over the decades. The Forest Service has built houses for employee families. The hospital, BC Electric, BC Tel, built several houses on Hospital Hill. They're all still there. Many will remember the green railway employee houses in 2 long rows on Cleveland Avenue between the Pavilion Park and Howe Sound Inn. They were built in the 1920s when the railway and Squamish were growing. Green was the railway's color, the only color of paint they seemed to have, also for community projects they helped out with, like the old Logger Sports Arena, all in green. The biggest boom time and worst housing shortage probably ever for Squamish was in the early 1960s. Housing was an urgent issue then for the community and several employers. People would find a house somewhere on the coast and tow it here. Wood fiber was being rebuilt and expanded. Empire Lumber Sawmill was being built. 2 major logging divisions opened up. Britannia Mines came back and was now interested in Squamish housing. And then there were 3 new elementary schools and an expanded high school. The school district and Ministry of Education responded with housing for teachers, built near the schools, still there today, as a rental housing on Wilson Crescent and along Government Road and elsewhere. The first parts of Garibaldi Highlands were developed in a teamwork between the developer, Pat Good, and Wood Fiber. Several houses along Air Drive, for example, still there today. The grandest example of teamwork to build new affordable housing for employee families was Valleycliff. Wood Fiber, then the Rayonier Company, bought the old railway logging camp lands from Maryland Ring and worked with other employers and all 3 levels of government to plan what became Valleycliff. An early planning map for Valleycliff found in the district archives recently has FPLA in big letters, Federal Provincial Land Assembly Project. Much of what was built as affordable housing for employee families is still with us today in every part of our town. The District of Squamish has recently taken initiative to protect some of the affordable rental housing built for employees and young families in the mid-1960s. Garibaldi Garden Court and Valleycliff Apartments are examples. Remembering their origins should also reinforce the message that we haven't been keeping up, but also that it was teamwork that responded in the past, and teamwork will be needed again.
For the second half of our program, I'll be speaking to two members of District of Squamish Council. Joining me now in studio are Councillor Jenna Stoner.
Hi there.
And Councillor Armand Hurford.
Hello.
Thanks for both sitting down to chat.
Thank you for having us.
Armand, before we begin speaking about affordable housing from a council perspective, I want to start by asking you a few questions as a business owner in town about the role housing costs play in the lives of your employees. First off, can you tell me a bit about your business?
Sure. We're a full-service bicycle shop, and that comes with, there's a certain seasonality that's sort of inherent to the business. It's a bit more popular to be riding in the sun here. So we have a seasonal aspect to our business, and we employ up to 16 people in town.
Can you tell me a bit about some of the housing situations that some of your employees are in?
We end up having quite a diverse group of characters. Maybe the bike industry is a bit of a collection of misfits. So people come from all walks of life and from all over. And we do quite a bit of our hiring from away, like when people aren't here. So we'll do Skype interviews. And one of the first questions that we have you considered the housing costs? Like, have you looked at, your Craigslist ads or what have you to get set up? And almost everyone has at that point, but it is a challenge. This season, I think I had 2 staff members for a period of time that were living in their vehicles, and one has since gone back to Germany. It fit very well with his plans, and he's a young guy, and that's how he wanted to do it. And the other person's has a roommate situation now and is inside, which I always feel better when everyone's inside, but a reality is that over the years we've had people living in vehicles as well.
Yeah, and I get the sense that is not an uncommon situation in businesses in Squamish, that there are other businesses that have people who choose to live in vehicles for a variety of reasons. Do you think that reality creates challenges for finding employees for your business or other businesses?
Yes, I think so. I think that in some ways people make a sacrifice to come to Squamish to participate in their sport. In my day-to-day, that's generally mountain biking. I'm sure it's the same. We have world-class rock climbing and the wind sport stuff, and they're sort of accepting of a certain level of sacrifice to do that. But I think now, with the situation we're in with the housing here, it's becoming a real barrier. With our same advertising methods, we're not seeing the same number of applicants. And I think that the housing is a big part of that. And I did also have some mid-season turnover this year where we had provided stable enough employment for a couple that worked for us for a number of years, actually, that they could be approved for a mortgage and they could buy a place. And it was a very happy time for them. And that place is somewhere that was more affordable. And that is something that I could see being repeated.
That must be a challenge to see that. And we even see that at Municipal Hall. There are sometimes employees that are looking for ways to find that home that they've been wanting to purchase, and sometimes it's not in Squamish. Do your employees talk about housing much in terms of a challenge, like in day-to-day conversation, or is it not something that comes up?
I wouldn't say it comes up in day-to-day. It does sort of spike when someone's looking for a place or there's someone new to town. And my mom ends up being the catch-all. So she's the welcoming committee. So she's got a couple extra rooms at her house, and almost everybody that comes ends up staying at my mom's house for a bit until they figure out how to find a roommate or how to actually get a spot lined up. So there's these little spikes where it becomes a hot topic because someone needs a place, and sometimes that place ends up being the support that we can provide. My extended family's been able to provide to sort of bridge some gaps.
So a new ECDEV strategy is to connect employers with moms.
Sometimes that 2-week window or 3-week window between spots can be a huge crisis for someone and can result in. That's where you end up living in a vehicle for a period of time, and sometimes you don't come back from that. So I think that there is a role where the employers can help, and where employees should feel safe asking for that help, because it's not an unheard of situation.
Certainly. On a broader scale, Jenna, What specific challenges do you see Squamish employers facing in terms of workforce housing, especially something that we'd consider from a council perspective?
There is limited, if none, in terms of workforce housing in our community, I think is the biggest challenge. The reality is that Squamish has been sitting at a 0 or near 0% vacancy rate for nearly 5 years now, if not a little bit more. And I think that that is having ripple effects, both in terms of the community connections that we're seeing in our town and having people leave, as Armand was just speaking about, to more affordable communities. And we're also seeing it with our economic development strategies and businesses having a hard time both recruiting and retaining staff in our community. We are starting to see a few businesses that are taking a little bit more creative solutions, especially those that have larger workforces. I know that the Gondola was able to secure some housing up at Quest University over the summer for a number of their employees. So we're starting to see some partnerships emerge and some creative solutions come forward, but it definitely isn't enough to provide the stability that folks need, especially given that so much of our employment is kind of tourism driven and often a little bit lower income.
I think those situations like the Gondola reaching out and finding housing to provide for their employees is it's not surprising that's coming. Armand, do you see a similar role or other roles that businesses might be playing in securing workforce housing moving into the future?
Well, there's the grander scale things like what Jenna just spoke about with the Gondola. But on a smaller scale, one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I know that this is within grasp of other businesses as well, is I have a network of people that I know own spots and own apartments that are renting, and I'm often their first call. So now I can go around my staff and say, hey, is anyone looking? There's this apartment and it's not advertised yet. And that is a level of trust between the business and the landlord, where maybe they wouldn't necessarily rent to any 22-year-old person off the street, but as they've been through an extensive sort of interview process and the landlord knows the business owner or the business itself, and there's a level of comfort there that may not exist, and sort of facilitating those two parties getting together. I think that that can be developed more formally with other businesses, and even just being on the business's radar that this is a piece of your employee's life that you can be involved in and positively affect.
Yeah, I hear hesitancy sometimes from landowners or homeowners about renting suites because of some of the strength of tenant protection in the Residential Tenancy Act. And so what you're talking about is highlighting another mechanism where some of the confidence in the tenant comes from a connection with business. That seems like a really interesting idea. And do you think there's a room for a more formalized process that ties into that type of connection, Jenna?
Yeah, definitely. It's something that council has looked at and actually directed staff to explore a little bit further. There are models out there. I believe Whistler is one of them that has taken this step towards securing a more formalized employment workforce housing type of structure, where the employer becomes responsible for that rental, and then that rental becomes tied to that employee's employment. So it's part of your employment contract that you get that rental space, and then the employer is able to back in, provide that security to the landlord. That's definitely something that we are excited to look into, and we also think can help incentivize some folks to put their potentially now short-term rentals into a longer-term rental pool.
Turning from workforce housing to the broader community, what are some of the impacts you've seen either as a councillor or as a resident from the high cost of housing?
Well, I grew up in Squamish, so I have a lot of friends that we've been friends since elementary school. And that number that's still in Squamish is dwindling rapidly as they're leaving for places where they feel they have more opportunity. And some of those people come from long sort of family traditions in town. And I think that's part of the strength of a small community, of these longer term generational things. Oh, that family, they're really into hockey and they just run the minor hockey program, and it's a tradition, as an example. So some of those traditions I find are being lost as these people are being forced to relocate. And it's not a new Squamish, old Squamish thing or anything like that, but I think it is sad when we're just sort of swapping out residents for other residents that can afford to be here. And that doesn't sit right with me.
Yeah, I myself have had friends who moved 6 times in 2 years. They offered to sign a multi-year lease with a number of landlords and weren't able to, and they ended up leaving town. That's just one of many examples that I can think of. And these are good people who wanted to be here and wanted to make it work, who love this community and just couldn't make it work. And that is on one end of the spectrum. And then we're also seeing on the other end of the spectrum where more people are living in their vehicles, living on the streets. And that is really, really challenging to see, especially as a member of council, where we're trying to represent all the folks who are in our communities. And we have more people who don't have fixed addresses, who are dependent on social services, and we're not providing the safety net and the housing first that they need to be able to get ahead.
We heard Maureen talk about the perception that the housing market would take care of itself over time, and that by increasing supply, we would eventually reduce the prices through addressing demand. But her point was that the Lower Mainland has a massive amount of demand, and that Squamish, because the price is relatively lower, will continue to attract people, and that it'll be very hard to overcome that amount of demand and bring prices down. What's your perspective on this? Are there ways that we can tackle this regional issue?
Well, firstly, I'd agree with that assessment of the situation. We are arguably an hour's drive from a major metropolis center, and it's a beautiful place to live. We live in a wonderful community. So that's going to be appealing. You throw a slightly lower price in, which seems absurd that we're talking about it slightly lower. It's ridiculously high, but it is slightly lower than the even more ridiculous pricing throughout the Lower Mainland. And there is a huge demand. So that will spur and has spurred investment from a development standpoint in Squamish. But it's not going to solve we're not going to solve the issue purely with inventory, because there is a massive demand.
I couldn't agree more with Maureen. And I think that the concept of leaving the affordability crisis to be solved by the market is the issue that got us here in the first place. The concept that we are using housing as an investment for retirement and our futures means that there's a whole bunch of speculation that's going into markets around the globe. And it moves us away from this concept that housing is a right, a human right, that we need to have roofs over our heads for everybody in our communities to make wholesome communities. And so the concept of we're going to be able to build enough housing to meet the demand one day, I think is a false platitude given what we've seen in terms of the market to date, decades of underfunding in both rental and affordable housing from the provincial and federal governments, as well as the globalization of international markets.
How do you see the municipal role having changed over time in terms of addressing housing costs and housing affordability?
I think municipalities have inevitably started to step up to the challenge because other governments have walked away from the table for so long. This really is a federal and provincial jurisdiction, but it has been downloaded to municipalities to start to deal with. And so we are using all the tools in our toolbox to become creative, to find solutions for the affordability crisis. The main one that we have is zoning, and we've used a few other policy mechanisms.
A common argument from housing advocates, which Maureen talked about, is that public investments in housing are far less expensive than the cost of keeping someone in homelessness. Service expenses for shelter, hospitals, police, or emergency services are far greater than the subsidies required for providing supportive housing. The challenge is that the benefit from keeping someone out of homelessness crosses different jurisdictions and different budgets. What's your perspective on this? How do we align those government interests to try and achieve something on this topic?
Well, that's a really excellent point. And I think it's hard to get all orders of government on the same page to move in the same direction. And we've had some successes recently with BC Housing, working on some projects in Squamish, and that's been amazing. But when you look at that sort of full scale assessment of the situation, bringing in the healthcare costs and the policing costs, and it makes total sense. But unfortunately, that hasn't come out in action from all three sort of orders of government at the same time, in the same direction, on the same projects. And that needs to change. I am hearing it being discussed more on as we're recording this, we're in the midst of a federal election, and it is a topic that some of the candidates are speaking about. And I hope that it comes to some action, particularly from the federal government, as we recently, I think we'd have a hard time saying that the province isn't helping a lot. They should do more, but they've been pretty generous to us in the last few years in Squamish.
Your question is an interesting one, Matt, and the way that you posed it, you mentioned that the challenge goes across orders of government as well as different budget cycles, and I'd say also our political terms. And so a 4-year political term is often not long enough to make the changes that we need to see on this issue, and I think that is one of the biggest challenges in terms of getting all orders of government on the same page at the same time. It presents a huge challenge, but I will also say that it has been done in other jurisdictions and other places around the world. Finland is a great example. They have implemented a housing first policy, and they've seen a 40% reduction in their homelessness rates in just a few years.
Armand, you mentioned BC Housing. Can you tell us more about that example for partnering with other organizations to try and address affordable housing beyond just the provincial and the federal government?
There's organizations that's their mandate is to affect the homelessness and sort of our harder to house residents. I think it was 2 weeks ago, I went for a tour of some supportive housing project in Vancouver, and it really showed me that things can be done and the positive outcomes are right there. And we know what needs to happen for some of these people, regardless of who it's led by. And it is fully life-changing for people. So I'm dodging your question slightly because you're asking where those opportunities are. And I'm going back just to the pure importance of it happening. There are these projects out there that are led by others besides the municipality or the province or the feds, and those groups can be the axis for everyone, all those orders of government coming together and sort of taking the appropriate step in the appropriate direction.
The project that Armand got a tour of, unfortunately I wasn't there, but it is one of many projects that's coming out of substantial funding from the province. They last year published the Homes for BC plan, which is one of the largest scale investments that we're seeing in housing since 2009. And they're looking to build 114,000 units across the province.
What are our biggest opportunities and what should our priorities be to support affordable housing in our community?
That's a great question because it touches on a previous conversation around how this issue is definitely focusing on the municipal government's actions. It's definitely a high priority for this council and for the previous council. And so there's a number of things that are currently underway, which are very exciting. One is a 76-unit affordable housing project on Buckley Avenue, which is the low and deeply subsidized affordable housing, as well as a medium income rental unit in the North Yards, which is about 40 units. Both those projects are supported by BC Housing. So we've been doing active work in terms of trying to get funding from the province to support the build of projects, which is really important to actually start to meet that demand.
I'd also like to add that in the background to that, a lot of work's been done on our perpetually affordable housing policy, which should lay out the framework to move towards a housing authority of some sort of governing body to help manage these dedicated rental units as well as the subsidized rental units as they come online. And coming online is sort of a piece that I'd like to take on for a minute. And the work that lands at on our desks as a councillor is a lot of the very preliminary work where should we go, which direction are we headed, how fast would you like to get there. And the Buckley and the North Yards are both through us. Now they need to be built out. So that lag time is something that is a little frustrating. There's such a need in our community. I'd like to see people, when we say, yes, okay, this is a great project, this is going to be a subsidized rental, go. I'd like those people to have somewhere to be, tomorrow night. But that's not the case. And whether that's waiting on budget cycles for funding or just construction timelines, it's hard because we want to take action quickly. And I feel that we have in the things that are actually in our control. And now it's out to the moved on down the line, and we'll see. The timelines are very reasonable. I'm not saying that they're artificially long or anything like that from a construction standpoint, but the problem has such a high priority for all of us on council. We'd like to see our decisions just sort of arrive there. Oh, look, there's a building and now we can house a bunch of people. But unfortunately, this solutions to this problem have a much longer timeline than the creation of the problem.
I remember it was probably about 3 months ago, we were in a council meeting, and on our break, there was a woman who was waiting outside the council meeting to talk to the mayor, who was in tears because she was getting kicked out of her low-income rental space the next week and didn't have anywhere to go. And so there are moments like that become so hard-hitting of, we are trying to do what it is that we can, but there are people in crisis today, and we just don't have the tools as council to help them.
One of the things that Maureen talked about was this gap between homeowners and people in other parts of the housing spectrum, that there's a conflict that comes up in established and existing neighborhoods where there's a reluctance to accept either different forms of housing or non-market housing or supportive housing forms. Do you see there being opportunities to encourage more acceptance of these housing forms in established and existing neighborhoods so that we can achieve some of these affordable housing solutions?
Definitely. But I think it takes time and it takes lots of community conversations.
And I'd like to challenge that concept a little bit, because I feel that as much as there are these larger, like the Buckley Project, for instance, is 80-ish units. That's a big change for that neighborhood, and it's a big piece. But as other developments are coming online, we've secured dedicated rentals in a lot of these new developments, and that's just one door in the hallway. It doesn't look any different. The people living there aren't any different than the rest of their neighbors, and there's strength in that neighborhood, and they're all gonna lift each other up. I don't think that we're going to see as big a challenge in our community as we've seen in some other communities as these bigger projects roll out, and that's based on our proven culture of being good neighbors and having empathy for our fellow humans and all those things that make Squamish so good.
I'm not surprised that our municipality is trying to respond to it because it's such a pressing issue for our community, but that could be quite a precedent to set and quite an ongoing responsibility to take on without any significant change in our revenue structure to take care of it.
And I think that's where this bigger piece around provincial lobbying comes in terms of changing what our revenue structures can be, especially with rezoning and redevelopment. So not to get into too many details around development cost charges and community amenity contributions, but we have limited tools in our municipality toolbox to be able to fund these sorts of projects. We have taken steps to try and increase the scope of that, but we are continuously working and trying to lobby the government to change the way that development cost charges regulation allows us to direct those funds to other types of projects.
More to come.
Always.
All right. Thank you so much for the work that you do on council and for sitting down and joining me today to talk about it.
Very exciting. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. It's been great.
We hope you enjoyed the conversation. For more on affordable housing in our community, visit squamish.ca/affordable-housing and connect with us for the latest district updates on our Facebook page at facebook.com/District of Squamish. And please tell us what you think of the podcast. Email us at communications@squamish.ca. Thanks for joining us.